to Haiti, and then we're doing this whole thing because of the issues and the conflicts there. I wanted to go specifically there because
He had the world at his feet, a velvet voice that could make you forget your own name, a falsetto that cut through the noise like moonlight slicing through darkness, and a stage presence that turned every room into a confession booth. Back in '96, when Maxwell's Urban Hang Suite first hit the streets, it wasn't just an album drop. It was a cultural shift, the kind of moment that made folks lean back, close their eyes, and remember what real R&B was supposed to feel like. Brooklyn-born, neo-soul royalty, the man who made loving feel like art. Maxwell wasn't just a singer, he was a movement.
What have you? And it's like, I know you, so I've been around you, I've seen you, but
Yeah,
I never really bother you about it. But like, what the hell?
But then something happened that nobody saw coming. Right when the lights were brightest, right when Fortunate sat at #1 on the R&B charts and the Grammys were calling his name, Maxwell went silent. 7 years. No album, no tour, no explanation. Just silence where that smooth voice used to be. Behind the scenes, his throat was failing him, a vocal hemorrhage threatening to steal the very gift that made him a legend. And the industry he once trusted had become a machine he didn't recognize anymore.
Something, flavor with a coke.
This is the story of Maxwell, the neo-soul king who almost lost his voice, but refused to let the silence win.
I just have anxiety about being able to represent, the legacy of the music. I still work with the same people.
You want to be at a stand. You have to keep a standard.
Before the silence, before the voice that moved millions, there was a boy in Brooklyn who learned too early what it meant to lose someone you never really got to know. May 23rd, 1973, East New York. Gerald Maxwell Rivera came into a world split between two cultures, a Haitian mother and a Puerto Rican father trying to build something solid in a neighborhood that didn't make that easy. The apartment was small, the streets were loud, but inside those walls was love, music floating through from the radio, and a father's laugh that the boy would spend his whole life trying to remember. Then, when Maxwell was just 3 years old, that laugh disappeared forever. His father killed in a plane crash, gone in an instant, leaving behind a widow, a grieving family, and a little boy with a hole in his chest shaped like a question mark. His mother and grandmother, devout Baptists with faith strong enough to hold up crumbling walls, pulled him into the church 5 times a week, sometimes more. There were hymns and prayers, testifying and tambourines, the kind of worship that shook the floor and made you believe God was right there in the room with you. Somewhere in all that singing, in all that call and response, Maxwell started searching, not just for God, but for his father, for some sign that love and loss weren't the only 2 notes life had to offer. Years later, he'd tell a reporter, "I wanted to find out where my father went." And that search, that longing, would become the heartbeat of everything he'd ever create. By 17, a friend handed him a cheap Casio keyboard, one of those plastic things with tinny sounds and a few preset beats, and Maxwell locked himself in his bedroom and started writing. He wasn't trained, didn't read music, couldn't tell you what key he was in. He just felt his way through it, chord by chord, lyric by lyric, pouring all that grief and all that church and all that Brooklyn into songs nobody had heard yet. 300 songs, maybe more, recorded on whatever equipment he could borrow, burned onto demo tapes he'd pass around to friends who told him he had something real. At 19, he was working tables by day and hitting the New York club circuit by night, carrying his demos like a preacher carries a Bible, looking for anyone who'd listen. The city didn't make it easy, never does for a kid with no connections and a dream bigger than his rent check. But Maxwell had something most people didn't, a voice that sounded like it had been dipped in honey and heartbreak, and a belief that somewhere out there, his father was listening. Nell's was the kind of place where reputations got made or broken in a single set, where the crowd didn't clap just to be polite, and the bartenders had heard every excuse for why your music deserved a chance. That night in 1991, when Maxwell stepped onto that small stage with nothing but his voice and a prayer, nobody knew his name. Nobody owed him anything. But when the first notes left his throat, smooth, vulnerable, aching with all that Brooklyn grief and church-raised soul, the room went quiet in a way that only happens when something real walks into a space full of pretenders. By the time the set ended, the whispers had already started. Who is that? Where'd he come from? When's he coming back? It took 3 more years of grinding, performing, passing demos, and waiting for someone in the industry to believe what that Nell's crowd already knew. That Maxwell wasn't just another singer. He was the sound of something the culture had been missing. In 1994, Columbia Records finally signed him, but the celebration didn't last long. Internal label chaos, corporate reshuffling, and nervous executives who couldn't figure out how to market a quiet storm in a loud world kept his debut album shelved, delayed, and stuck in limbo for nearly 2 years. Then, April 2nd, 1996, Maxwell's Urban Hang Suite finally hit the streets, and it was like the whole game exhaled. This wasn't the R&B the radio had been pushing. No flashy hooks, no guest rappers, no gimmicks. Just a grown man's voice telling grown folks' stories over lush, layered production that felt like candlelight and slow dances and late-night confessions you only share when you trust somebody. Ascension, Don't Ever Wonder, dropped that July, and by October it had already shipped 500,000 copies, certified gold. The album spent 78 weeks on the Billboard 200, eventually moving 1.79 million copies and earning double platinum certification. Rolling Stone called him the best R&B artist of 1996, and The Independent declared his debut the sexiest record of 1996, which was another way of saying the man had reminded the world what intimacy sounded like. But it was bigger than numbers, bigger than plaques on the wall or radio spins at rush hour. Maxwell, alongside D'Angelo's Brown Sugar and Erykah Badu's Baduism, had birthed something new. Neo-soul, they called it. A movement that valued artistry over commercialism, depth over disposability, and soul over spectacle. When the world wants something from you, it doesn't ask politely. It takes and keeps taking until you forget what you even had to give in the first place. By 1997, Maxwell's face was everywhere. His voice the soundtrack to slow nights and fast feelings. His name on everybody's lips from the streets to the suites. The Soul Train Music Awards crowned him Best New Artist and Best R&B/Soul Album, Male. And when he stepped onto that stage to accept, the applause wasn't just loud, it was reverent. MTV came calling with an unplugged special, which in the 90s was like getting knighted. A stamp that said your artistry transcended format, generation, and genre. Suddenly, Maxwell wasn't just a neo-soul pioneer. He was being compared to Marvin Gaye, to Prince, to the architects of black music who turned pain into beauty and desire into scripture. But fame has a funny way of reshaping you without permission. The quiet kid from Brooklyn who used to hide behind melodies was now being called symbol. His image plastered across magazines with headlines that had nothing to do with his music and everything to do with a fantasy the industry wanted to sell. In 1998, Maxwell released Embrya, his second album, expecting the same embrace he'd gotten the first time around. Instead, critics panned it, called it self-indulgent, too experimental, too far from the formula that had made him a star. The mixed reception stung deeper than he let on, planting seeds of doubt that would grow quietly in the background while he kept performing, kept smiling, kept playing the role of the untouchable artist who had it all figured out. By 2001, he bounced back with Now, which landed in the Billboard Top 20 and proved he could still deliver what the people wanted. But something inside him had already started shifting, questioning, pulling away. The tours kept coming, city after city, stage after stage, crowds screaming his name while his throat screamed back in ways only he could hear. 2001, 2002. The grind never stopped, and somewhere in all that noise, Maxwell started to feel the weight. Not just the exhaustion, but the disillusionment. The creeping realization that the industry he'd trusted was more interested in profit margins than protecting him. Years later, he'd admit it plainly. I became disenchanted with the industry and began to question why I was making music. A cage you can't see is still a cage, and Maxwell was starting to feel the bars close in with every contract negotiation, every creative note from executives who'd never written a song in their lives, every demand that he be more commercial, more accessible, more like whatever was topping the charts that week. Columbia Records, the label that had signed him, shelved him, and eventually released him into stardom, was now the same machine grinding him down. Conversations about his next album turned into battles over creative control, with suits in boardrooms telling the man who'd helped birth neo-soul that the market was shifting, that hip-hop was dominating radio, that his sound was too soft, too slow, too stuck in a lane the world was moving past. But it wasn't just the boardrooms that were breaking him. It was his body. During those relentless tours in the early 2000s, night after night of pouring everything he had into performances that left crowds breathless and him voiceless, Maxwell started feeling it. The strain, the soreness, the way his throat would tighten and refuse to cooperate no matter how much rest he tried to get between cities. He didn't talk about it publicly, didn't want anyone to think he was weak or washed, didn't want the headlines to shift from Maxwell the legend to Maxwell the liability. Behind the scenes, something more dangerous was brewing. Vocal hemorrhaging, swollen blood vessels in his vocal cords that turned every note into a gamble, every performance into a risk that he might lose the one gift that had saved his life. The doctors would eventually tell him what he already knew in his gut. If he didn't stop, if he didn't rest, he might never sing again. 7 years is a long time to be quiet when your whole identity is built on sound, when the thing that saved you becomes the thing you can't trust anymore. The doctors had a clinical name for it, vocal hemorrhaging. But what it meant in real terms was simple and terrifying. The blood vessels in Maxwell's vocal cords were swollen, inflamed, bleeding internally every time he pushed his voice beyond what his body could handle. The diagnosis didn't come with a timeline or a guarantee, just a stern warning that if he didn't stop immediately, if he didn't submit to surgery and complete vocal rest, he might lose his voice permanently. Not diminished, not weakened, gone. So Maxwell did the hardest thing an artist can do. He stopped. No farewell tour, no press conference, no dramatic goodbye. He just stepped off the stage in 2002 and didn't come back. The silence that followed was deafening, not just for his fans, but for him. Sitting in that quiet wondering if he'd ever find his way back to the music, or if this was how the story ended. Not with applause, but with a doctor's note and a career cut short. The world didn't wait for him. By the mid-2000s, R&B had shifted hard into hip-hop fusion. Neo-soul was fading from radio playlists, and new stars were rising to fill the space Maxwell had left behind. The internet started spinning stories to fill the void. Whispers about drug addiction, mental breakdowns, diva behavior, all the usual suspects when a black artist disappears without explanation. Maxwell never addressed the rumors publicly during those years, partly because he owed the world nothing, partly because the truth was too vulnerable to share with strangers who'd already made up their minds. When he finally did resurface in interviews years later, he was candid. I never wanted to stay away this long. It was to live life and rediscover my voice. But between those words was everything he didn't say. The fear, The isolation, the mornings he woke up wondering if he'd ever sing again, the nights he went to bed knowing the industry had moved on without him. The surgery came and went. The vocal rest stretched from months into years, and Maxwell had to rebuild his relationship with his own throat, relearning how to use the gift that had defined him. The vocal rehabilitation was grueling in ways the public never saw. Surgery first, precise and delicate. Doctors working on tissue so fragile that one wrong move could end everything. Then came the therapy, the exercises, the slow process of relearning how to use the instrument that had once felt as natural as breathing. Complete vocal rest meant exactly that. No singing, no talking beyond what was absolutely necessary. No testing the limits to see if he still had it. Years later, he'd tell Essence magazine plainly, "Vocal rest saved my voice and my career." Maxwell retreated from public life completely during those years, disappearing so thoroughly that even the paparazzi lost interest. This was before social media made privacy impossible, so when Maxwell said he was gone, he was truly gone. Traveling, thinking, reconnecting with the spiritual foundation his mother and grandmother had built in him back in Brooklyn. He had time to ask himself the questions most artists never get to ask until it's too late. Why was he making music? For who? And what was he willing to sacrifice to keep doing it? By 2008, something had shifted. The voice was coming back, not exactly the same, but stronger in the ways that mattered. And Maxwell found himself in Miami studios with longtime collaborator Hod David, quietly, carefully, beginning to lay down tracks for what would become Black Summer's Night. There was no label pressure this time, no timeline dictated by executives who didn't understand the creative process, no rush to capitalize on a moment that had already passed. July 7th, 2009, Black Summer's Night hit the streets like a love letter written in the language of survival, and the response was immediate, overwhelming, undeniable. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, moving 316,000 copies in its first week, Maxwell's highest first-week sales ever. And suddenly everyone was talking about the man who disappeared for 7 years and came back sounding not weaker, but wiser, deeper, more intentional than ever before. Pretty Wings, the album's lead single, landed at #1 on the Hot R&B hip-hop songs chart and stayed there, eventually spending 47 weeks on the chart like it had nowhere else to be. The song was about grace and loss, about the beauty of letting go, about loving someone enough to set them free even when it breaks you. Pretty Wings is a song about grace and beauty and parting, he'd say simply, but anyone who'd followed his journey knew it was about more than a relationship. It was about his relationship with the industry, with fame, with the voice he'd almost lost. The accolades came fast. 2 Grammy Awards in 2010 for Best R&B Album and Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. Critics calling it one of the best albums of 2009. The kind of universal praise that reminded everyone why Maxwell had mattered in the first place. The album went platinum, selling over 1 million copies in the United States, proving that audiences were starving for the kind of substance he'd been offering all along. But Maxwell wasn't done. In 2016, he released Black Summer's Night, the second installment of his planned trilogy. And once again, the critics and fans showed up, ready to follow wherever his voice was willing to lead. By 2019, he was performing a 4-night residency at the Kennedy Center with the National Symphony Orchestra. His music elevated to the level of classical art. His voice, the one doctors said might never return, filling that prestigious space with the same power and vulnerability that had made him a legend 2 decades earlier. And in 2021, Maxwell did something even more significant. He left Columbia Records after 25 years and signed with BMG under his own label imprint, Moosey. It was the ultimate reclamation, the final piece of the puzzle he'd been working on since that first hiatus. Not just getting his voice back, but getting his power back, his autonomy, his right to create on his own terms and his own timeline. That return, that refusal to let the industry dictate his timeline or compromise his artistry, became the most powerful lesson Maxwell would ever teach. That sometimes the bravest thing an artist can do is choose their soul over the spotlight. Today, Maxwell's influence ripples through every corner of modern R&B. His fingerprints on artists who weren't even born when Maxwell's urban hang suite first dropped. Over 1 billion streams, more than 10 million albums sold worldwide, and a catalog that's been sampled, covered, and studied by a generation of singers who understand that real soul music doesn't age. It just becomes more essential. In 2021, when that debut album celebrated its 25th anniversary, the tributes poured in from artists who credited Maxwell with showing them that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that taking your time wasn't laziness, that refusing to chase trends was its own form of rebellion. The Congressional Black Caucus Foundation honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019 for his innovative contributions to the music industry. The Soul Train Awards gave him their Legend Award in 2021. And in 2022, he paid tribute to Michael Jackson at the Billboard Music Awards with a performance so powerful it reminded everyone why his voice still matters. Through 2024 and into 2025, Maxwell continued performing. The Serenade Tour, a headlining slot at the Roots Picnic replacing D'Angelo, a scheduled appearance at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Still giving audiences that same intimacy, that same depth, that same refusal to phone it in or sell out. The final album in his trilogy, Night, remains unreleased, and there's something beautifully fitting about that, about Maxwell moving at his own pace even now, trusting that the music will arrive when it's ready, not when the market demands it. "Music is my sanctuary," he once told Essence, and sometimes making it public is exhausting. Maybe that's the whole story right there. A man who learned that protecting his sanctuary was more important than feeding the machine, that his voice was a gift to be honored, not exploited, that real artistry requires boundaries the industry will never respect unless you enforce them yourself. Because in the end, Maxwell's story isn't just about a voice that almost disappeared. It's about what it means to choose your soul over the spotlight and trust that real art will always find its way back home.